So welcome to our seminar, the SAFPAC seminar. Very pleased to invite back Jonathan Webber. I hope you've all seen the last time he was here, the brilliant seminar he gave, which is on our YouTube channel. This time, Jonathan, who's head of philosophy at the University of Wales, I think in Cardiff, is going to explore with us anxiety about absurdity. Over to you, please, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Now, it's been a while since I've done this. So is this working? Can you now see my slides? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Good. Okay. All right. So I'll start with a quick overview of what's going to happen in this talk. What I want to do is to kind of trace an idea as it develops through existential philosophy and existential thought more broadly, in fact. And this is the idea of anxiety as a feeling that is related to absurdity, right? So in fact that it's a feeling that's about absurdity, and the idea that life is absurd, or our whole existence, or the universe as a whole is absurd, and that this is an unsettling feeling. And I think that, well, the particular strand that I want to trace starts, I think, with the thought that there is no God to determine the meaning and value of our endeavours. And we find that in Nietzsche and in Dostoyevsky. But then I think it sort of moves on from that idea about God to, in a way, a simpler idea, which is just that the world doesn't seem to display any meaning or value that would justify our endeavours. So everything seems ultimately pointless, no matter how important it seems to us at the time, because there's nothing out there in the world that would justify us doing the things that we do. And I think that's the idea that in different ways animates Kafka's novels and also Camus' novels and essays. And then finally, I think, and people who've seen me speak before or read some of my work won't be surprised that this is my view, that the best version of this absurd idea about absurdity, the most precise and most advanced version, is the one that we find in French existentialism, right, in the works of Sartre and Beauvoir. And this is the version of the idea that says, look, the meanings and the values that we experience, right, we seem to find in the world, that we respond to reasons that we find in the world, but we only find them there because of the values that we already have. So what seem to be invitations to behave in certain ways or proscriptions against behaving in certain ways are in fact just reflections of our own commitments and our own projects, is their technical term for this, or our goals, if you like. And so as a result, it looks like there's nothing out there that then can justify us having the particular goals or values that we have, because anything that appears to be a reason for anything already presupposes the goals or values that we have. Okay, so that's the kind of development, I think, the developmental line of this idea. It starts off with a kind of death of God idea in the 19th century. But by the time you get to the middle of the 20th century, as Sartre himself points out in his lecture Existentialism and Humanism, it's not really about the death of God. It's not really about God or the existence of God at all. It's just about this point that the meanings that we find in the world seem to reflect the commitments we already have. Okay, so let's begin at the beginning. Oh no, hold on, let's not begin, because the second part, having traced the development of that thought, then I want to talk about Beauvoir's response to the problem, which I think has been much overlooked. Beauvoir published a book in 1944 called Pyrrhus and Sinius, which is a short book, or just a long essay really, that did extremely well in France. but it sort of got forgotten in all the publications from both Sartre and Beauvoir that came shortly after that, from 1945 onwards. There's very little reference to it, and as a result, it got forgotten. There was no English translation of it available until 2010, I think, or maybe it's 2008, but a long time. And even then, it only appeared as in a hardback volume of Beauvoir's essays that was very expensive and was basically just made for university libraries. It's now available as a paperback from Penguin at a very good price, but they've shied away from giving it its proper title as well. So it's actually, they've called it What is Existentialism, which makes it sound much more boring as a book than it really is. So they really should give it its original title back, I think. So anyway, it's called Pyrrhus and Sinius, and I heartily recommend it. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the second phase of this talk. Right? Beauvoir's argument that even though all the reasons that we seem to find in the world and we experience in the world are reflections of our own evaluative commitments, there is nevertheless a moral imperative to respect human freedom, where freedom is ultimately that structure of our existence that makes our evaluative commitments shape the world that we experience. Right? So that ground of the reasons that we experience in the world itself, on Beauvoir's view, is objectively valuable. And not only does that mean that there is a moral imperative, but also because that kind of human agency and that human creativity and evaluative ability is itself valuable, she thinks that any human endeavours that are within the constraints of the moral imperative are themselves valuable because they're expressions of valuable human agency. So this is simultaneously a response to the kind of moral question about whether there can be any moral rules given the nature of human agency, and a question to the kind of existential, an answer to the existential question of whether our endeavours are completely meaningless and pointless and worthless, which she thinks they aren't, so long as they're within the moral rules. Okay, so that's very neat, right? It addresses both the moral question and the existential question with the same answer. And so we'll come to that shortly. But first, as I say, I want to trace this thought from the 19th century through to the French existentialists. So starting with Dostoyevsky. So I think Dostoyevsky is absolutely central to the development of the idea of absurdity. Especially kind of two themes in his work. One is a concern with what he, I think, sees as a kind of disenchantment of the world. As the kind of Enlightenment mentality takes hold and people have a kind of more rationalistic and scientistic attitude to the worlds around them, they become less religious, they become less believing in other things, in sort of folklore and kind of animistic understandings of the world around them. And that disenchantment of the world, I think Dostoevsky thinks is problematic, right? And secondly, but also one of the problems of that, I think, is he sees a kind of rise of a kind of technocratic approach to society, to politics, but also more broadly to kind of moral and social and cultural life, as though all that we should care about is working out how best to achieve the goals that are already set for us by the rational scientific nature of ourselves and the world around us. I think he's finds all of that very problematic. And obviously he's not the only person in the 19th century to find that problematic, but I think the way in which he does is strongly influential on the development of this idea of absurdity. So we find this, for example, in Notes from Underground. There's a picture there of my favorite edition of this in English. And I think what's really happening in part one of Notes from the Underground is a kind of rejection of this scientific, utilitarian, in every sense of the word, rationalist idea that we are best off just conforming to the structure and meaning that is inherent in the world and in our nature. We should just find out what that is, respect it, and go with the grain, as it were. And that's the best way to live. That's an idea that he sees as prevalent and growing in his society, and he thinks, or at least his character, Underground Man, rebels against. And in its place, he wants to assert a kind of picture of individuality, because I think he sees that as kind of subsuming the individual into this system, if you like. And the individuality that he wants to assert really consists in a kind of much wilder, irrational, desire-driven aspect of our nature, which is why Underground Man, especially in the things he says in part one of the book, but also in the things he does in part two, which are pretty problematic themselves, just seems sometimes wildly irrational, self-defeating, undermotivated, and so on. But that nevertheless is the kind of individuality that Dostoevsky wants to assert, and I think it has to be that way in order to contrast with the kind of rationalist utilitarian scientism that he wants to oppose. So that's one strand of this in Dostoevsky. The other is just as famous, I think, is most clearly distilled in the Brothers Karamazov. I mean, it's in other works too, right? But this is the famous concern that, as one of the characters, one of the Karamazov brothers, Dmitri, puts it, without God, all things are permitted, right? If people no longer believe in God, if the religious structures of society have crumbled away, then what are the moral rules? And what are the motivations for that people would have for following any particular kinds of moral rules? Right? And that kind of question very much drives, I think, that whole novel and the different paths that the brothers take. So that's his concern there. I mean, one form of it, maybe I've slightly overstated it there on the slide, that there can be no morality without a divine grounding. Or at the very least, if the divine ground that people have always taken to be the ground of morality has now been swept away, or is receding, then what? What takes its place, if anything? Can anything take its place? That's the kind of, more importantly, I think, the question that's being raised by Dostoevsky here, rather than that he's actually pressing for a particular kind of answer to that question. So those are the themes in Dostoevsky that I think are very influential on Nietzsche. Nietzsche is full of praise for Dostoevsky, and I think those themes kind of coalesce in Nietzsche's thought. So Nietzsche famously declares in various places, but I think the passage that's most often quoted is from part 3 of The Gay Science. God is dead, right? God is dead, and we have killed him. At least that's as Nietzsche writes everything in lots of different voices and in all sorts of funny ways, as I'm sure you know. So it's never quite clear what Nietzsche himself thinks. But one of his characters, who he calls the madman, declares that God is dead and we have killed him. Nietzsche himself does make similar points in his own voice, but not quite as crisply as that. And the madman goes on in this very poetic way to talk about how we've unchained the world from the sun and pulled the plug out and drained the ocean, and that we've lost the grounding of morality. We've lost any kind of anchoring of our lives. Right, so any kind of sense of right and wrong, any kind of sense of propriety is entirely, thinks the madman, washed away once we realize that God is dead. But not only morality, at the same time, and this I think is what connects those two thoughts in Dostoyevsky, they become connected more clearly in Nietzsche, that we've lost the grounding for believing in any rational structure or any meaning to anything, right? So Nietzsche sees that kind of scientistic understanding of the world, of the structures of reality, as itself a kind of hangover from the religious mentality, right? Because if the world is God's creation, then it has to all make sense. But if the world isn't God's creation, there's no reason to think that it does, right? It could just be wild and irrational and unpredictable. Or as Nietzsche puts it in some of his earlier work, Dionysiac, right? Just completely unstructured and dangerous. So that's, I think, how Nietzsche connects these ideas in The Death of God. It's not just about the loss of moral grounding, it's about the loss of any reason to believe that there's any meaning or structure or order or rational discoverable sense to anything. Okay. But he famously thinks in The Gay Science, people still believe in all that stuff. People still believe in God. People still believe in morality. People still believe that we can uncover how things work, because he thinks either they haven't quite understood that God is dead, they just haven't heard the news, or they haven't really taken it on board, or because they haven't noticed the consequences. And I think this is what he's more interested in, the idea that people could have ceased to believe in God and ceased to practice their religion, but they still see the world in a way that's informed by the old religion that they think that they've given up. So they still believe in an objective morality, even though they shouldn't. They still believe in structure and order and meaning, even though they shouldn't. As I say, this is in a lot of Nietzsche's writing, but it's most clearly crystallized in part 3 of The Gay Science. All right, so that's enough of the 19th century, what we want to move on to now is how this thought transmutes, I think, in the early 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century. And as I said in the introduction, what happens here is that I think the kind of consequences of that idea of the death of God, as Nietzsche describes them, kind of take on a life of their own. They become unchained, unanchored, if you like, from that whole idea about the death of God. It's no longer really particularly about the decline of religion. It's not particularly about theism or atheism. It's just more about people's direct experience of the world. And I think that's what you find in Kafka. Kafka was a big fan of Nietzsche. And I think Kafka wants to, I mean, there's a lot going on in Kafka's world, but one of the things he's doing is developing these aspects of Nietzsche's thought in fictional form, especially in his novels, The Trial and The Castle. Now, as I read him, though, he's not just presenting Nietzscheanism, right? And he's not just unanchoring it from the thoughts about the death of God. He's also, I think, developing, in a way, a more sophisticated version of the problem, because I think his version of the problem is much more skeptical than Nietzsche's and much less dogmatic. Right. So for all Nietzsche thinks that we can't make rational sense of the world, or the world doesn't have the order it would have had if it was created by God or whatever. Nevertheless, Nietzsche seems very definite about that. Right. He thinks, and this is a kind of questionable aspect of his thought. Well, why should he be so definite about that, given the nature of what he's saying seems to itself undermine any reason to be confident that he's right about what's beyond the appearances of the world. So I think Kafka gets that, and he understands it. He's less dogmatic, and he's more skeptical, right? But nevertheless, he's in a way, nevertheless, he still thinks that there's a kind of absurdity to existence. But I think in a way, this is where we really get the clearest idea of absurdity that's come out of those roots in the 19th century. So Nietzsche asserts a metaphysical claim, right, that there is no objective structure or meaning to reality because there is no God to provide that. Kafka doesn't make that claim, I think. So Kafka's lead characters in The Trial and the Castle, so in The Trial it's Joseph K, and in the Castle it's K, also known as the land surveyor. They are both striving to understand their endlessly confusing situations, right? That's one of the things that's going on, and they have to. They've been put in a situation where it's fundamentally important to them to get to grips with what's going on here, but they just can't seem to do that. Nothing makes sense, and every time they try and make sense of anything, the problem just becomes more confusing. But neither of them ever reaches the conclusion that there is no meaning or structure there to understand. It's always unclear, I think, whether there is in fact a meaning that they're trying to uncover but failing, or whether there's just no meaning there at all, and that's why they can't uncover it, right? They never find that out. And I think neither do we, right? There's nothing in the novel that allows us as readers to conclude either way on that. Maybe there is some sense going on in the trial and Joseph K never uncovers it. Or maybe it's all just absurd and meaningless all the way down. And that's why it always appears that way to Joseph K. We don't know, right? That's left undetermined, I think, in the novel and in the Castle as well. So that's what I mean when I say he's more of a skeptic rather than a dogmatist. He doesn't make that metaphysical claim about objective meaning. It's just an epistemic claim that we can't find the objective meaning. So both of those characters are endlessly spurred on by the possibility that they will discover the meaning. And that, I think, is what brings with it a certain kind of anxiety, right? They don't understand their situation, but they need to understand it in order to get on with their lives. Right? And it's that tension that generates the anxiety and that kind of claustrophobic and dense atmosphere that you get in reading these novels. They become increasingly aware that there might not be anything there to understand. I think that's right. I think in the trial, Joseph K at some moments suspects that there isn't really anything going on here at all that makes any sense, or that at least that everybody else involved is equally perplexed as he is, right? The lawyers that he deals with, the judges who are supposedly judging his case, although I'm not sure he ever meets them. I think he does sometimes suspect that they don't know what they're doing either, but he can never be sure about that, right? And similarly in the Castle, I think it's as much to do in that case with the land surveyor's relations with other people he meets in the village, where there is this sense among the people in the village that maybe none of this actually does make any sense. But again, they're not sure, right? They never find out whether that's the case. So it seems to me that what you get in Kafka is the first kind of, in this strand of thought, a unified idea of absurdity and anxiety. It's the first time it's really a sense of absurdity in that strong sense, and with it comes this anxiety, right? Because we need to make sense. This is his picture. I think we need to make sense of our world, of the world, and of our place in it, right? We want to have a kind of meaning in our life. But we continuously fail to do so. Everything always slips away from us. When we think we've grasped something, we think we understand something, then everything shifts and it slips through our fingers. And more deeply, more profoundly, we can't tell whether this is because there is no meaning to understand or whether we just haven't found it yet. And so on we go, right? Aware that we're failing again and again, and yet still doing it, right? Because we can't help it. And I think that's what makes it kind of absurd. This sort of endlessly striving in the knowledge that is probably just going to fail again. That's what makes it absurd, but that's also the tension that generates this kind of anxiety or angst. Now, when I say that, that's, I think, the kind of first and most important and clearest kind of crystallization of this deep sense of absurdity, and with it the kind of anxiety that it brings in Kafka. Obviously, you know, this language of absurdity and to some extent of anxiety is most often associated with Camus, right? His book The Myth of Sisyphus, and also the novel The Outsider, or The Stranger, L'étranger. Now, Camus was also very strongly influenced by Nietzsche and by Kafka. Camus, however, I think Camus doesn't quite get how good Kafka is. So that's a little bold thing to say about one of the greatest writers in the 20th century, but I think in his essay on Kafka, I think he slightly misses the point. I think he reads Kafka as closer to Nietzsche than Kafka really is. I don't think Camus quite grasps that shift from the metaphysical view that you get in Nietzsche to the epistemic skeptical view that you get in Kafka. And Camus essentially refines the Nietzschean view without taking that, or Camus does, without taking that Kafka route. So Camus presents absurdity as a clash between two things: a basic human need to make rational sense of the world, which Camus thinks is just built into human nature, right? And there being no rational sense to be found, right? So we have to try and make sense of things. We can't help it. That's how we're wired. That's what human minds are, right? But we can't make rational sense of things because there is no rational sense to things. So you can see that this is essentially the Nietzschean metaphysical picture. It's a refined version of it, but it's essentially that same view. Here's how he puts it in The Myth of Sisyphus. There's the cover of my favorite edition of this. What is absurd is the confrontation of the irrational with the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart, right? It's not the irrational itself. It's not the fact that the world is meaningless. That's not what's absurd. And it's not the fact that we try to make sense of things. That's not absurd. It's the fact that those two things coexist and necessarily coexist, that tension cannot be overcome, but nevertheless, one part of that tension is us continually trying to overcome it. That's absurdity in Camus. Now, having just been a little negative about Camus, here's what I think is one of the really important contributions Camus makes here. So far, we've been talking about, or I've been talking about the individual trying to understand the world, right? Understand reality and our place within it, right? But Camus points out, and you know, this is there in Nietzsche, but I think Camus brings it out very well, that it doesn't only affect our relationship with the world around us, it affects our relationship with each other, right? Because we strive to make sense of the people around us, but he thinks that that can't be done. And our relation to ourselves, right? We try to make sense of ourselves, and we can't, because nothing actually does make rational sense, not even ourselves. So that there's a kind of alienation built in to this absurdity. We're alienated from ourselves because, and the same reason we're alienated from each other and from the world, because we want things to make sense and they don't. So it seems to me that the most important insight here is this point about self-knowledge, but also to some extent about knowledge of other people. Until you get to Camus, you do sort of get this impression, especially I think in Kafka, of the kind of lone individual facing the world and trying to make sense of it and trying to get on with their life. Whereas in Camus, the problem is also how to get on with each other and how to get on with yourself and understand yourself. So I think that's Camus' most important contribution to this tradition. But I do think that Camus has missed Kafka's development of the idea of absurdity from Nietzsche's metaphysical claim, and Kafka just stays on that metaphysical plane with Nietzsche and doesn't move to the essentially epistemic idea that I think drives Kafka's novels. And I also think Kafka is the one who's right about all of this. I think Kafka, well, or closest to being right. So I think his skeptical position just seems more defensible, right? Because if it's genuinely true that you can't make sense of the world, then what can justify making that metaphysical claim about whether or not the world actually does make sense? Surely that claim should itself just be in question, whether there is any objective meaning. It shouldn't be something which we seem to be able to answer. So I think Nietzsche and Camus try to have it both ways there. We can't make sense of the world, but somehow a couple of privileged philosophers understand what's going on behind the scenes. I think Kafka, as I say, has the more defensible position. But not only that, I think that the epistemic, see, it's a funny thing, but you might think that by shying away from that metaphysical claim, Kafka's view is kind of less deep, is more superficial, because it doesn't get to the real nature of reality, whereas Nietzsche and Camus do actually make a claim about that. But actually, I think it goes the other way. I think Kafka's sense of absurdity is deeper, right? It's deeper because it shows it shows why there's a kind of inescapable need to, or striving at least, to try and make sense of things, right? What we're left with from the Nietzschean and Camusian position is the question about why we can't just give it all up and be nihilists. Why can't we just accept that nothing makes any sense, and maybe even celebrate that, or at least treat everything with a kind of ironic detachment? Kafka's position is that no, you can't, you're not justified in doing that either. There really is no way out, right? Because you're just stuck in this epistemic form of absurdity. And I think that brings with it the kind of deeper kind of anxiety and tension and the generally miserable atmosphere of Kafka's world. Is more justified by that epistemic absurdity than it would be by the metaphysical picture, for the same reason. You know, once you understand the metaphysical picture, why not just accept it? Camus thinks he's got an answer to that, which is something like, well, you can't, because human beings are just not wired that way. But that seems like an undermotivated kind of very handy point for him to make. Whereas on Kafka's picture, that question never arises, right? You're not justified in concluding that there is no meaning. All right. So that is quickly a line that goes from Dostoyevsky through Nietzsche, through Kafka to Camus. And as I say, I think that Kafka has the better sense of absurdity and anxiety there. But Camus has this important sense about self-knowledge and knowledge of other people as well. So that's kind of the first part of the talk. I'm now going to move on to the claim about French existentialism and how this, I think, really gets going in the thought of Sartre and Beauvoir, especially. Beauvoir's book that I mentioned, Pyrrhus and Sinius, again, named after two ancient Greek characters and a little legend about them. Just like Camus' book, The Myth of Sisyphus was. It came out 2 years after Camus' book. She's clearly kind of got that in mind as something that she's replying to, I think. But the way in which her thought is grounded here is also closely bound up with Sartre's phenomenology. But before we get to that, I just want to make a terminological point, and of course the obligatory advert for my book, Rethinking Existentialism, because part of the purpose of that book is that I think the word existentialism gets used too broadly, right? It gets used to name all sorts of things which have only sort of fairly tenuous connections to each other, and you just end up losing any sense of it as a unified sort of tradition of thought at all, and you sort of start wondering why include these people as existentialists and not other people. And sometimes people, write books which have such an expansive sense of the word existentialism. It tends to just mean thought or something as thought, thinking about life. I mean, and it's just a bit pointless. I think we can go the other way, right? And understand existentialism as something very precise, and that is the theory. The word first got its meaning when it was defined by Sartre and Beauvoir to mean their philosophy in 1945, in the aftermath of the war. And I think we should stick to that. But I think that part of the confusion arises because of a close similarity between the word existentialism and the word existential, right? So existential thought, existential philosophy, existential literature is, I think, an inquiry into the structures of human existence and their ethical relevance, right? So, what is it to be in the way that we are, as opposed to the way that cats and dogs or chairs and tables or stones and rainbows are? What is it to be like us? Well, it's a bunch of things. We're self-conscious, we're social creatures, we are aware of our own mortality, right? I mean, the basic ideas there of what the structures of human existence are. I think that's what existential thought is about. It's about what those structures are, how they're related to each other, and also their relevance for ethics in the broad sense of the word. That is the Socratic sense of ethics. That is what it is to live well, how we should live, right? Which includes the narrow idea of morality, like right and wrong, what's permitted and what's impermissible. But it's also broader. It also includes what's good for you and what flourishing looks like. So I think existential thought is about that, how we should understand ethics in the light of the basic structures of what it is to be human. And if you understand that as existential thought, then all the people I've talked about so far are clearly existential thinkers, right? That's what they're doing in different ways. Two of them are primarily novelists. Two of them are philosophers, but who also write in a fictional way. Existentialism is a particular theory that results from that inquiry. It's a set of answers to those questions, and an integrated, single, unified theory that addresses that big existential question. And it's the answer given by Sartre and Beauvoir in the 1940s, which they call existentialism. And that's where the word came from, pretty much. So what is that theory? Well, it's defined by this idea, as Sartre puts it, perhaps a little unhelpfully in his lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, that existence precedes essence. That is, that individuals don't have an inbuilt kind of set of goals and purposes that they're trying to achieve, but rather that set of goals and purposes is based on their values that they form, that they endorse, and that they can change. Right, so our evaluative commitments come first at the ground level, as it were, and that those are commitments, and that we don't have to be committed to them, and we can change them, and that it's on the basis of those commitments that we see the world as presenting to us the reasons that we then respond to. And secondly, that's a descriptive point about the basic structure of human existence. Then here's the ethical upshot of that, according to Sartre and Beauvoir. That freedom, which consists in the fact that our behavior is a response to reasons which are themselves reflective of our values, which we choose, right? That freedom is itself intrinsically valuable, right? And the foundation of all other values. So we should respect human freedom, and we should treat expressions of human freedom as valuable. Okay, so that is what I think existentialism is, and that's what's going on in my book, is that I'm arguing for that. And that's what's going to inform what I say now about anxiety and absurdity in the thought of Sartre and Beauvoir. Okay, so there's Sartre. One of the core claims of existentialism, as I've kept saying, is that we experience the world as a field of reasons, inviting us to do some things, proscribing other actions, right? Some things we find attractive, some things we find repulsive, some things we find attractive, but also not allowed, and so on. That's how we experience the world, not just as a bunch of blank stuff, but as a kind of living field of reasons to behave in one way or another. But those reasons reflect the values that we agree with, and that we have the freedom to change those values, however difficult that might be. So part of the theme of my book is that Sartre and Beauvoir actually disagree about what kind of freedom we have over those values in 1945, when they first start sort of using this language of existentialism. By the time you get to the end of the 1940s, Sartre has changed his mind and now agrees with Beauvoir's position. So on that position, it's a lot harder to actually change the values than Sartre first thought. And that's essentially because they become ingrained over time. You can think in ways that are kind of free of those values, and you can even disagree with the values that you hold, but if they're deeply ingrained in you, they're still going to influence the way you see the world and the way you feel about things. And overcoming that is a gradual and difficult process. That's the view that Beauvoir holds all along, and that Sartre comes round to agreeing with by the end of the 1940s. But even so, even with that view in place, there is still freedom to change those values. They're not set in stone. And I think it's on the basis of that core claim of existentialism that Sartre and Beauvoir develop a new version of the problem of absurdity, or a particular take, if you like, on that, especially kind of Kafkaesque experience of the world. Both of them are, again, big fans of Kafka. So if the reasons we experience just reflect our values, this is the kind of one aspect of this version of the problem of absurdity. If the reasons we experience in the world just reflect our values, then what could justify having those values, right, rather than a different set of values? It can't be justified by the reasons that we find in the world, because that's circular. Those are already dependent on our values. So what would justify it? And if there's no justification for these values, then that's absurd. We value things, we care about them, but there's no justification for that at all. And there's no justification for you having your values, and there's no justification for me having mine, however different or similar they will be to one another. In that case, then indeed all things are permitted, as Dmitry Karamazov suggests, right? There are no moral rules. They just seem to be, but that's just a reflection of our individual commitments. And that's the kind of moral problem, if you like, but there's also a kind of existential problem. My commitment to my values is just arbitrary. You know, I strive to achieve particular things, but I could have just been striving to achieve something else. It doesn't matter, right? And that seems kind of absurd, given how much effort I put into achieving these things, right? And how much I do care about them. At the same time, it feels like they don't really matter. So that's the kind of existentialist problem. It's rooted in the basic idea that the reasons we find in the world reflect the commitments we already have. Okay, there's Simone de Beauvoir. Beauvoir, in the book I've talked about, Pyrrhus and Sinius, sets this up in a particular way. I'm not sure whether this is, I've written on the screen there a particular version of the problem. It might not be, it might just be a particular way of dramatizing the problem, right? It's a particular kind of perspective on the problem rather than a variety of the problem. But look, we are essentially creatures that value goals, and we aim to achieve our goals, and we care about those goals. That's essentially what we are, right? That's the fundamental structure of human existence, according to Beauvoir. And when we do achieve them, she thinks, we generally no longer care about them. We just move on to new things. We move on to new goals, right? Once upon a time, you cared lots about passing your O-levels or your GCSEs, or maybe you didn't, but if you did, it was important to you. But as soon as you got them, you moved on and started doing something else, right? It ceased to be that important. You may have celebrated for a short while, but pretty soon it's not that important anymore. You just move on to new values, and you can't help that because that's what you are. That's what it is to be human, right? Is to value things that need to be achieved, not to just carry on valuing the things that you have achieved. And because we all know that, and we have that experience, we kind of, however much we have and haven't really thought about it, we do all have this sense that the things we care about are only valuable to us because we're caring about them, and that at some point we'll stop caring about them and then they won't be important to us at all. We have that sense, but we also have to care about them. So we do care about them. We think they're important. We value them. We can't help that. But at the same time, we kind of think, yeah, but they're only important to us because we value them, right? And so that, she thinks, is absurd, to have both those perspectives simultaneously. But they're both inescapable, right? There's no way of solving this problem by just stopping caring about your goals. You can't, because you're human. That's what it is to be a person. Neither can you kind of shake off that sense that once you've achieved them, you won't care about them anymore. You'll move on to something else, because that's your experience, right? Beauvoir's solution to the problem is to say, look, just because you stop caring about something once you've achieved it, it doesn't mean it's not valuable to you, right? Or that it's not valuable, even better, per se. Because actually, goals that have been achieved don't just disappear. They can be, and often are, what she calls a potential means. Well, actually, sorry, what I call a potential means to further ends, further projects. Her phrase is a point of departure. So if I value a goal, right, then I must value achieving that goal. That's the same thing as valuing the goal, right? Trying to achieve it. Valuing the goal means valuing achieving that goal. But then what does it mean to value the achieved goal? Well, I can't value it as an actual means to further ends, right? Because that would be a regress. That would require that that further end was valuable. So then we've got a circular justification. Each end is valuable because it becomes a means to another end, and a means to another end, and a means to another end. So that's a kind of infinite. Well, I've put a regress there. Actually, maybe it's progress. It's going forwards. But anyway, it's an infinite chain, and every item is valuable only because of the value of the next one. But there's no end to the chain. So then none of them are valuable because they're all perennially deferred for their value on something that is perennially deferred, right? So it can't be that I value my achieved goals as actual means to further ends. She's also got other arguments for that, but I think that's the core one, the one about the infinite chain, right? So I have to accept the value of the achieved goal as a potential means, a point of departure, not as an actual means, right? So once I've achieved something, it's valuable because it can be used as a means to an end, not because it is. And then that doesn't require that the end it's being used for is valuable. All it requires is that the capacity to use it as an end, as a means to an end, is valuable. That's the core idea in Pyrrhus and Sinius. Obviously, I'm presenting this very quickly, and there's a lot of detail would have to be fleshed out here and a lot of objections that could be raised. But this is the basic line of argument. It's because I value my ends, and I can't help but value my ends, and it's because I do that I ought to value human agency. Okay, because I ought, if I value my end, I therefore value its being achieved, If I value it's being achieved, that only makes sense if I value it being a potential means for some other purpose. So I ought to value it as a potential means for some other purpose. But if I do that, then I ought to value the ability to use it as a means to another purpose. And that's human agency. So there's an imperative there. From the fact that I value my goals, I ought to value human agency. So this is very neat. The basic idea is that the nature of human agency entails that human agents ought to respect and value human agency in general. So we, as people, are subject to a kind of moral imperative that we ought to respect and value human agency. No other creatures are subject to that moral imperative because it follows from being a human agent. Well, unless there are aliens on other planets who also pursue goals in the way that we do, right? But no other creatures that we know about. It's because of the kind of existence that humans have that humans are subject to that moral requirement. This is a version some of you may well recognize. This is basically a version of Kant's thought, Kant's categorical imperative. Kant's arguments for his view are much longer, much more complicated, and involve all sorts of metaphysical commitments ultimately. Beauvoir seems to have cut a kind of very neat line through to that conclusion without requiring the kind of framework of transcendental idealism that Kant uses. So here's the other interesting aspect of it. So far, that shows us why there are moral imperatives. It's not true that everything is permitted, right? Violating human agency is not permitted. Killing people, torturing people, manipulating people in ways that undermine their agency or destroy their agency is morally wrong on Beauvoir's view. And because human agency is itself valuable, expressions of human agency are valuable, right? Because they're expressions of something valuable, unless that value is cancelled out by their failure to respect human agency. So if you're doing something immoral, any value that thing would have had as an expression of your agency is cancelled out by the fact that it violates the imperative to respect human agency, right? But anything that's within that imperative, anything that's morally acceptable, is not only morally acceptable, it's also kind of valuable, existentially meaningful and valuable as an expression of human agency. Okay, so it seems to solve the existential problem at the same time as the moral problem. At least that's the promise of Beauvoir's argument. There's an objective moral law that you should respect human agency, and there is value to human endeavours within the constraints of that law. But immoral actions are absurd. The rest are really valuable. So we're not wrong to value our goals. They are valuable so long as they're morally acceptable. So there's no absurdity within the constraints of morality. And she's done all of that without needing to resurrect God, right? So this kind of completes, in a way, the departure of the problems of absurdity and potential immorality from the death of God hypothesis. The solution turns out to have nothing to do with God. It makes no reference to the transcendent or the divine. According to Beauvoir, it's just about human agency. It's just about who we are as human creatures. So Camus and Kafka are quite right that we cannot seem to find objective meaning by looking for it in the world, right? Both Camus and Kafka think that, and they're both right to think that. Well, on Beauvoir's view, that's because they were looking for objective meaning in the wrong place, right? It's not out there in the structure of the world, right? Dostoyevsky and Nietzsche were right, in a sense, that there is no transcendent guarantee of meaning or value out there in the world or beyond the world in God. But they were wrong on Beauvoir's view to think that there ever needed to be, right? The guarantee of it is human agency itself, not something out there. So Sartre's famous 1945 lecture, Existentialism is a humanism. That's what it means. That's what it means to say that existentialism is a humanism. It's human agency that is the ultimate foundation of all value. It's intrinsically valuable, and everything else that's valuable is valuable because it's an expression of human agency, or perhaps also this can be extended in a way that Sartre and Beauvoir didn't consider, to think that it's also valuable as facilitating human agency. So you might think that the natural world is valuable as an arena for human agency, and the catastrophe of climate change is not simply that the world will change, but that it will become uninhabitable, or at least extremely difficult to inhabit. Right? This argument in Pyrrhus and Sinius, as I said, Beauvoir's book was published in 1944. Sartre's famous lecture was in 1945. And he says in that lecture, very briefly, he sketches basically Beauvoir's argument. He just doesn't mention Beauvoir's name, and he doesn't mention the book. And so Sartre scholars have been very puzzled by this, and they've rooted around in all of Sartre's other publications and his notebooks and everything, trying to find more detail of this argument that he sketches. And they have been looking for that in the wrong place. They should have been looking for it in Beauvoir's book, Pyrrhus and Sinius, that came out the year before. I'm not suggesting Sartre was in any way ripping Beauvoir off here. He was very clear, as she was, that they were engaged in a joint enterprise here, that they were both arguing for the same view. And he uses first person plural quite a lot when he describes that view. Perhaps it would have been better if he had been even more explicit and actually named Beauvoir's book when he summarized it. But summarizing it is definitely, I think, what he was doing. Okay, that is the end of the talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. That's thank you so much. Let's open up some questions, comments, please. And if you can put your picture on if you're there, if we're having a group thing, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Jonathan. I just want to say I really, really enjoyed that. It was really stimulating. I'm glad I turned my mic off when I did, because I'd been tapping away, making a lot of notes throughout. So I'm not going to mention everything. Just one thing, I don't know if it was because I was too busy making notes on this final bit about de Beauvoir. I've tripped up on something in my mind, and I missed the link when you went on just talking about this, how we ought to, there was something de Beauvoir was saying that this sense of, you went from just talking about this capacity to sort of use means, endings as a sort of a being valuable, and as a sort of valuing, then going on to sort of say that we ought to value human agency. I don't know if you could say a bit more about that, because I sort of missed maybe the thread.
Yeah, no, sure. Thank you. Yeah, so, excuse me. I mean, the basic idea, I think, is that if you value something as if you value an achieved goal, right? If you're valuing a goal, that means you're valuing achieving the goal, right? Because that's the same thing as it being a goal. And so then the question is, well, what value does it have once it's been achieved? And one option would be that it can actually be used as a means to another end, but that isn't going to answer the question, because that just relies then on the value of the next end, right? And so then the question is, why is that valuable? And so it just goes in a circle. The other way to go is to say it's valuable because it can be used as a means to an end by a human agent. Well, why would that be valuable? Well, only because human agency itself is valuable. So I think her argument works as in a way a kind of process of elimination. You're committed to the value of your goals just by the nature of being human, and that entails that rational agency is valuable, because that's the only way that your goals can actually be valuable. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. We earlier in the week on our Thursday meeting, we were looking at this Sartre's idea of which again was I don't think we had enough time to open it up on the Thursday, and we're planning to do it next week a bit more. But this idea that we're, I suppose, sort of have a very limited menu of choices within ourselves. Like we can't choose to be everything, and I think it taps into a bit of that, doesn't it? Really, perhaps that agency is still important. Yeah, we can't. We're not infinitely malleable.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's right, and that we have to. So is the thought there that we have to kind of choose particular goals and pursue those, and that excludes other things? Right.
Yeah, I suppose so, and the question of how limited we are within ourselves and each as individuals as to what goals we might be able to pick for ourselves. So there's this thing of valuing our own agency, but also being aware that I might be, let's say, in contrast to some of my peers, be limited in what I might be able to choose to do in life because of my brain, my history, what I've been through, for example.
Right.
I don't know. Yeah, anyway, that's probably enough to be said about that for now. But yeah, thanks for a bit more clarity.
No, thank you.
Hi, Jonathan. Really enjoyed the talk. Very good, thanks. I just wanted to ask something about meaning through goals, which seems to be a big focus there. The achieving of goals. And I guess something comes up for me in regards to that's a very objective. It's the doing of things, it's the completion and that kind of idea. But there's something, isn't there, kind of an opposing idea, which is the experience of things, which is kind of that to be in the process of doing, you can be it, you can be there, and it's very experiential. And I think Sartre says something about that when he comes to the conclusion about art, that to do art, and I know he spins it with the idea he wants to complete this work, eventually. But I just think there is something about that idea of, being in something as opposed to doing something, that it's not about the completing. And I suppose I am specifically thinking about art and the flow state people can get into, and the sense of meaning, and almost some people would describe it as something spiritual, a spiritual sense of meaning just in the process of it, as opposed to the completing of it. So I just wanted to know, did you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this is one of the things that I'm really glad you asked it. I hadn't thought of this in exactly that way before in relation to art, but as a more general point, it's something that I wanted to get across. I was hoping somebody would ask a question that would help me do it, because there's something a little misleading about that argument, Beauvoir's argument, as I set it up, right? Because the argument focuses on achieving goals. So it focuses on the kind of goals or the kind of actions where there is an end point and you achieve it and then it's done, right? And that's the thing that can become a potential means. But there's lots of things we do which aren't actually like that. They're continual processes. And there are lots of valuable things that we do that seem to be just continual processes. And this art example is a good example. I think Beauvoir's position fits that view. I think it explains actually the value of continual processes, or in a way processes that themselves are either purposeless or just done for their own sake. And the reason is that the conclusion of Beauvoir's argument is that human agency is valuable, and that within the constraints of morality, then expressions of human agency are valuable, and that those are kind of endeavours are expressions of human agency. They're expressions of human creativity, of valuing, of being able to respond to situations and shape situations and all the rest of it. And that's what she thinks is valuable. So the argument focuses only on the kind of goals that are achievable and complete, but the conclusion applies to everything.
Yeah, because I was thinking within the context for us here, psychotherapy, it's hugely important because obviously, within the modern day, but for many clients, they have a very objective, goal-oriented mindset. They can do at least. And it can be very difficult, you know, to switch to this experience of it's in the doing, not in the, or sorry, it's in the being, not in the doing. It's not about getting somewhere, it's just about experience. So I think that's something that seems to come up for us a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you again for the talk.
No, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I would slightly quibble with the wording there, because I think it would still be a matter of doing, even if there's not a specific, you know, end point when the thing is done. You know, sort of engaging in kind of artistic practices for their.
I see what you're saying. Is it about being in doing? I'm not trying to negate the doing. I'm more saying that there's something about being in doing as opposed to doing to arrive somewhere, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah.
There is a strange thing about the word goal, isn't it? It sounds quite behavioural and rational. You know, it's not the drive, not drives or needs, or in particular, I suppose nowadays we talk very much about desire. But you're saying whatever, the argument would still hold. Her argument would still hold up whether it was desire rather than goals. I think that's what you're saying. I think, is it?
Well, desire, yeah, sort of. I mean, so what's going on there really, I think, is that the best English word to translate the French that's being used here is end, and this is a kind of continuation of the kind of Kantian thought about ends and means and ends, right? But in the Kantian tradition, and I think certainly in French philosophy, that notion of an end, it doesn't just mean, it can be translated as goal, but it can also be translated as value, right? So it's a goal, but it's a goal that you care about, but that's not quite the same as desire. If you desire something, it means you want it. If you value something, it means you think it's important and you think it's good. Now, quite often those two things go together, but not always, right? Sometimes you want things that you know aren't good. And sometimes you think things are good, but unfortunately you just don't want them. So it's more that kind of evaluative attitude rather than desire, I think, is what they're trying to get at. And that's what then can drive Beauvoir's argument, right? Because you are committed then to something being valuable, rather than just being something you want.
Daniel or Sally?
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm just trying to think about this human exceptionalism that the Beauvoir sets up, and I guess not only her, because I wonder what are the consequences of letting this thing, you know, it's like once the door of exceptionalism is open, you cannot bolt it back, and then once humans are exceptional, so they have some privileges in the world. And that seems to set up a chain that might end up with racism. You know, then we might need then the client comes to us thinking that they're exceptional, you know, and why wouldn't they be exceptional? Because as humans, they're exceptional. And then, you know, the kind of the climate catastrophe that we are witnessing now, isn't that also a kind of a byproduct of human exceptionalism? I mean, another way of saying the same thing is that it seems that the Beauvoir and Sartre, and that's perhaps something to goes about existentialism not in general, but with many proponents, they never really questioned the notion of individualism or individuality. And that leads us to a kind of to embracing a very particular form of identity thinking and identity politics. So I'm thinking in this context, you know, how would, for instance, Deleuze reply to these arguments, you know, saying that, you know, there is no human exceptionalism. There are only ebbs and flows of energy that constitute, you know, that have certain junctures. Okay, I'll stop there. Maybe.
Yeah, okay, good, thanks. So just a couple of points in response. So the point about exceptionalism, I mean, yeah, the first question you raised was whether that could kind of lead to a kind of a narrower sort of exceptionalism that would then sort of drive racism or sexism or some other kind of discriminatory attitude. But I think you know, their view, Sartre's and Beauvoir's, is exactly the opposite. It can't do, right? Because it is specifically human exceptionalism. So it is specifically about human nature, they don't like the phrase human nature, but that's because they understand it a particular way. So it is about of what it is to be a human being, which is to be a kind of creature that sets goals that are valuable to that person and pursues those values. It seems that that's what people do, right? And so there are no distinctions on their view between people. Now there might be questions there about whether there can be psychiatric difficulties that impair the ability to do that. So I guess there's a worry that that's a direction where there might be a distinction within human beings, but it's not obvious that there should be, or there would be. So, but then your other concern, well, one of your other concerns was a kind of environmental concern about if it's only human beings that matter, then that's the kind of attitude that leads to people just destroying everything in their path. But I think that's, I mean, it is an attitude that can lead to that, but it shouldn't, right? It shouldn't lead to that, because if what matters is human agency, then it's essential that there should be an environment that's conducive to continuing human agency, and the destruction of the environment that we've seen and the looming climate catastrophe is a catastrophe precisely because it's not going to be conducive to human agency, right? It's going to be massively restricting, it's going to kill a lot of people, it's going to displace a lot of people. It's the effect on people that's catastrophic, at least from an existentialist perspective. Yeah, and that third point about the kind of Deleuzian and the kind of very structuralist view that there's just sort of crisscrossing, and there are different versions of this, fields of energy, or there are kind of social political versions of this thought. We're just sort of nodes in networks of political influence or whatever. I mean, that's right. That is something that the existentialists reject. Right, they think that's just false, and that's because they have this view of our freedom to reevaluate our own evaluative outlook. We're not just programmed. I think a lot of the criticism of existentialism that you get from people like Deleuze and Foucault and to some extent Derrida focuses on the earlier version of that view. So when I said that Sartre and Beauvoir disagree in 1945 about freedom, Sartre's view is that it's very simple, this kind of radical freedom. We can at any moment just throw off our entire evaluative outlook and our upbringing and just do something else. Beauvoir never believed that, right? And by the end of the 1940s, Sartre had come around to Beauvoir's view. So they both think that actually you're strongly influenced, obviously, by your upbringing and by your cultural inheritance and so on. But at the same time, you have the rational capacity to step back from that, to question it, to formulate other views. Doing so doesn't, in and of itself, remove the influence of your upbringing. It leads you into a position where you no longer endorse that influence, but that influence will still be there in your kind of immediate responses and in the way you see the world. But over time, you can that can be waned away. And I think that does explain why life isn't that static. People do find themselves moving on from their upbringings and changing the way they see the world. And I think that's how moral change, at societal levels, happens. So I think they do have the better picture there, to be honest.
Thank you.
So would you say then that absurdity and where it ends up, it's sort of like final end goal then is to sort of harming others, really? Then that's where what it ends up being, if we're looking at what de Beauvoir has said.
Yeah, that's right. But what's wrong? So this is important though. But what's wrong with harming others isn't that it's absurd. What's wrong with it is that it's morally wrong, right? But it's also true that it's absurd.
Yes.
So if you're going to try and just do something that's morally wrong because it will be meaningful for you, well, you're going to fail, because it won't have that individual kind of existential advantage either. What you'll be doing will be completely worthless. That's the idea.
Yeah.
So yeah, what's immoral is absurd, but that's not why it's wrong.
Can I say something? I mean, just to say, of course, no, I really enjoyed the talk. I think there's lots in it, and I want to argue a bit about the sort of dogmatic version of Nietzsche that you've got there. I'm not sure. I'm not really sort of convinced about that. But that's by the way. What I think is more interesting is something that you touched on a little while ago, Daniel. I don't know. Let me see if I can sort of say it in a way that makes sense. That makes any sense. I think when Sartre moves towards de Beauvoir, with this idea of, I think it's something to do with acknowledging how sticky, I suppose, how our views kind of hold us. He is making a step. It's one step, but the question is whether or not there could be a further step. Maybe they do make it, and I just don't know about it. Which is to do with how much time, place, history is what sets the context for these values. Because I think there's something to do with the individualism that Daniel was talking about. You see, when you say that, I think you said something about how de Beauvoir doesn't resurrect God, and she doesn't think, as Dostoyevsky and Nietzsche do, that we need God to sort of help, God or the world or whatever it is to justify what we do and think. I'm not sure that Nietzsche thinks that we need God so much as that actually that we were in the grip of that sort of religion, and it's a historical sort of matter that we no longer are sort of captivated by it. So now we find ourselves historically, sort of culturally, in this position where actually we no longer are captivated by it, and therefore the question is, what do we do? You see what I mean? I think there's something about that move into something more cultural and historical, political.
Yeah, okay, no, that's fair enough. I think that's right. So, I mean, and that's, I guess, where he ends up, isn't it? What we need is, as he puts it, a revaluation of all values. It's not that he doesn't end up as a nihilist, I don't think. I think that's right. It's not that he thinks that there's no hope or that there could be no value, but he does seem to think that it's gonna take a long time. We've got to do a lot of rethinking, and that we're kind of adrift at the time that he's writing. So yeah, I mean, you could, I guess, in an optimistic way, think that what comes out later in existentialism is part of the revaluation of values that Nietzsche thinks needs to happen, right? So that would create more kind of continuity between them. Yeah. Also, on your earlier thought, I mean, yeah, I was a bit dogmatic in how I describe Nietzsche. That's always a bad idea, isn't it? He's
he's very slippery, isn't he?
Yeah, and deliberately so. I mean, he even, there are places where he says he doesn't want to be understood. He wants to be learnt by heart, or whatever it is. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to be agreed with. He wants to make you think and make you do this work, and that requires him to be hard to understand. And that seems right. Even so, I think the picture that he presents in that passage in the Gay Science, which he ascribes, he never quite ascribes to himself, he ascribes to other people, does seem to suggest that there's no clear sense or meaning to everything. I think he is also kind of tempted, though, by that thought, although it may be not about values, because he thinks there can be a reevaluation of values, but that other thought about there being no kind of objective structure or meaning to the world. And so, when he talks about truth, that truth shouldn't be understood as an attempt to map the way things really are. It should be understood in terms of, what's conducive to human flourishing. I think he is tempted by that thought that there just is no objective structure, or at least if there is, it isn't what's important. Yeah. So maybe.
he's absolutely tempted by that, and I think you touched on it. There's a question about, you know, whether or not we can ever sort of, there's a question, it's always an epistemological question about what we can know, and, you know, and are we going to talk about the world beyond what we can know and all of that sort of stuff. But I mean, he is certainly tempted by it, and he plays with it, doesn't he? In some ways, the stuff about the death of God in the gay science, as you say, he doesn't say this is my view. He has this man who comes and announces that God is dead, and people laugh at him. But I think there's something conveyed there that the madman has understood something, or is bothered by something that the others around him are not bothered by, and he says, "I've come too early." And I think again we get to time and history and place, that, you know, that maybe if the madman did this, I don't know what, in the 20th century, it'd be less of a big deal. But then there's something about, you know, no one knows what he's talking about. So I guess I'm trying to do something about a kind of relativity of values and things like that, and views.
Yeah, good, thank you. So yes, right, and that was part of your original question, was, yeah, how does that Sartre and Beauvoir picture fit into this kind of, how does history and historical place and time fit? And I think, I think it does, and I think it does, and it fits better with Beauvoir's view than with Sartre's early view. So the idea is that, you know, the world in which you operate and the world in which you find your reasons and your values is a world that is not just made up of physical objects. It's replete with kind of meanings, social meanings that are already there, right? You're born into a world that already has a language, that already has institutions and other cultural objects, and so on. And so, you know, all of that meaning is already there, and it's in that web of meaning that you develop your values and your reasons. And it's still within that web of meaning that you can kind of reevaluate your own values and reflect on them and think about whether you actually agree with the ones that you were brought up with, and whatever. You can't really step outside of that, a historical epoch, and behave as though you lived in, you know, medieval Germany or somewhere. So that's all already there, but nonetheless, none of that stuff is kind of directive, right? It sets up a kind of an understanding of how things are, but whether it's still open for you to value them as they are, or to want to change them, right? So there isn't, I think they want to distinguish between that kind of social meaning and reasons for action, reasons for the attitudes that you have, and those reasons are ones that are down to you, even though the meanings are socially and historically constructed.
Thank you. I think I'm thinking about what you is, you know, in all of that. In you know, again, there's something about the individual you, but you know, I'll go on forever. I can shut up.
But you're right. I mean, that is the core of it. I think that really is the core of it. That they do have that insistence that there is that, and that it is, and what it essentially is for them is the evaluative structure of your projects and your goals, right? And the values that you have and the reasons that generates for you. That's something that is down to you, and you can reflect on and you can change. Yeah, and that's the bit that's not simply socially constructed.
Yeah, I mean, I you know, of course, I'm very tempted, and I know I must stop it, but I'm very tempted to sort of say, even with Sartre and de Beauvoir, it's not a you. It's something about Sartre and de Beauvoir, sort of how they speak to each other, how they interact with each other, and how Sartre changes as a result of her. And I guess there's something, isn't there, about how we change as a result of the people around us, and also something about how over time we have different sort of views, and in different places we have different views. I guess I'm trying in a way to make the you that makes these sort of choices, these options more difficult to sort of to be confident about.
Okay, yeah, good. Good. Yeah. All right. That's interesting. Though I would say Sartre's very stubborn. It took a long time for him to actually come around to her view. And I think he did so on his own terms. So in that sense, as an example, that's not so much an example of kind of social influence, more of, if anything, kind of resistance to social influence, and then finally coming to see that he couldn't resist it anymore. And so kind of making his own decision. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Del.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jonathan. You certainly, well, hopefully you haven't come too early and not too late for us, but just in time for us to consider ourselves and our lives and how we help or hinder other people. So, Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. Can we give him a round of applause? Turn your mics on. Thanks very much, Jonathan, and very much hope you can help us again another time. It's really super having it and having it on YouTube.